Hi, everyone. My name's Laura. I am one of the graduate students who's on the Bias Busters team. If you have never heard of Bias Busters before, welcome. We are a group of graduate students, staff, professors, undergrads that started in electrical engineering and computer science here, but we've been expanding. And what we're trying to do is just start a conversation on issues surrounding biases, diversity, inclusion in tech, and just in universities in general. So we have had a few events in the past, so maybe you've seen us at some of those. We had a very fun one on Monday. Anyway, so today we are hosting our fourth speaker for our Reframing Tech speaker series. We are very lucky to have Dr. Colleen Lewis with us. That's her. She is a Berkeley alum and is a current professor at Harvey Mudd, where she's doing research on CS education. And while she was here at Berkeley, she started CS Kickstart. So we're really excited to have her and thank our speaker. Thank you.
Team, I'm really happy to be here. I'm Colleen, and I'll tell you a little bit about myself and a little bit about Harvey Mudd, but mainly I want to try and make this be like helpful workshop for you. So this is what I'm about, is I want to try and make computer science more accessible. I want to understand and optimize learning and identify and remove barriers. So my research area is computer science education, all focused around this equity and inclusion sort of stuff. And I did undergrad in EECS here, and then I worked in tech maybe that doesn't count. I worked as a software engineer at a game company. And then I came back and I did my master's in CS and PhD in education here. And if you're like, oh, I'm interested in education, like we can talk. And there's good classes in the education school. And now I'm a professor at Harvey Mudd College. It's east of LA, like an hour or so, and we have like 820 students. We're like super, super small, and we have a lot of women who do computer science. So even when I got there in 2012, about 40% of our students identified as women, and now we're about 50% of the faculty identify as women, and about 50% of the students identify as women, and it's like super rad. From my perspective, as a white woman, I'm just like, oh, like I'm not aware of my gender when I am like teaching, and that's like a nice thing that's different from when I was at Berkeley. Okay, team, and I've got one of my NSF's projects is csteachingtips.org, where we have tips for teaching computer science. One of the things that I brought with me today is tips for department inclusivity. We've got a bunch of tip sheets online, but it's like, oh, you're like, oh, I'm really busy. What are the 7 things that our department should do to think about creating a more inclusive space? Like I have paper for you, yeah? And we've got a bunch of them, so, reducing bias in the classroom, I would guess that folks in Bias Busters would be interested in that. And even ones that are about, how do you lecture, are actually about how do we create inclusive classrooms. So sometimes it's veiled, and it's just about lecturing. Oh, don't worry, it's not about inclusion, but it's really all about inclusion. And then each of them have videos with really unfortunate still frames for all of them, yeah. And then we have, this is a little harder to use, but we have 1,200 tips online. So you might find something where like my students, hey Brian, my students are having difficulty understanding, sorry, was that inappropriate? My students are having difficulty understanding this thing, type tap, 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 arrays. Oh, look, here's 10 tips for how to teach students about arrays or what they have difficulty understanding. Okay. All right, let's dig into the meat of it, which is we're going to be talking about diversity and inclusion sort of stuff and bias in general. And am I still okay over here? Yeah? Okay. And I think a thing that happens is people say diversity, and then what they actually mean is they mean white women. They mean people that look like me. I'm like married to a man. I'm what they picture. I'm middle class. Like I'm what they picture. And we want to, in every chance we get, try and push that boundary. Be like, oh, actually, like, humans are pretty complicated. They have more than just a gender. And so maybe we can think about this wider view of diversity and thinking about the ways in which, I can't just figure out, oh, what is this experience for this type of person? And what is this experience for this type of person? And oh, someone can be both of those. And maybe understanding the impact of those identities and the ways in which the world interacts with them is more complicated than just an addition problem. And so I want us to be thinking inclusively in that. Okay. So we're going to work through some examples, but actually like a lot of our examples are going to be focused on women. And I'll talk you more through about like why am I doing that, rather than focusing on some of like the more important conversations around race and racism. Okay, so I want to start with a thing that I actually hear all the time is women are great collaborators. Give me some nods or some shakes. Have people heard this? Yeah. And so then I think like, oh, if I find a woman who's not a great collaborator, should I take her woman card? Do you know what I mean? Like be like, hand it over. You think you identify as a woman, but you don't get to anymore because they're great collaborators, damn it. And like also, if a man, someone that's male identified wants to collaborate or is a good collaborator, like is he being feminine? Like, oh, maybe that also doesn't make sense. And a lot of times, whether it's about gender, which is a spectrum, I'll come back to that in a second, whether it's about gender or race or class or all the things, a lot of times we have these narratives about some pattern of like, oh, these people are all like this. Sometimes they're just like legit stereotypes, but I think with things like this where you're like, oh, that seems positive, I think it can still be problematic. Okay, so let's pretend that there's a gender binary for just a second, and let's talk about differences between male and female performance. So one, there's not evidence to suggest that women are more collaborative. Like I did a lit review on this, and I was like, oh, nope, it doesn't, like, and maybe it's that psychologists haven't looked at it enough, and there really is a difference between the means between men and women, but not that I could find. And I think a lot of stuff where there is a difference between the means for men and women, like the difference might be meaningless. And so, take the like math SAT or math ACT. On the math SAT, there used to be a gender gap. There's not anymore. One, you don't hear about that. You just hear women aren't good at math or whatever. There used to be a gender gap. And you're like, a gap? Was it statistically significant? It was. But I feel like in this room, we're like mathematically literate, and we're like, oh, but like, yo, what was the difference between the means? What was the effect size? What was the difference between the mean measured by the standard deviation? You're like, oh, actually it was really small. So like on average, a man would get a quarter of a question right more than women. And you're like, oh, cool. So this like broad picture pattern of knowing someone's gender identity might help us predict their SAT score, like plus or minus a quarter of a question. But it actually, that pattern, if we're not asking the question of what's the effect size, what's the practical application or meaning of that difference, we pay attention to differences that are actually meaningless. Like if that's how small the effect size is, even if it's statistically significant, is someone's gender a good predictor of their math performance? No, they're mainly overlapping bell curves. But in our society, we think about these stereotypes, and I think even for mathematically literate, we picture like two non-overlapping bell curves whenever we talk about these patterns. And so one of my pushes for us is to think about like, oh, when people say stuff like that, be like, oh, all the time? What data do we have for that? Every woman? Like, really? Like, and this thing seems like a positive thing, but actually I think it can make less space for all humans regardless of their gender identity. And I'd just like to imagine that for the women are great collaborators, that like there's a cookie cutter that makes women. And then we're all like great collaborators. But I also think there's like, okay, well, maybe I'll give you more preface before this. So a thing that happened to me when I was at Berkeley, even when I went to declare my major as EECS, was I got the talk that was like, Colleen, you're a people person. You won't like sitting in a basement coding until 3 in the morning. And I was like, those are all true. I don't like coding alone. I don't like basements particularly. And my preferred bedtime is like 8:30 p.m. Like, whew, brushing my teeth at 8:25. Do you know what I mean? And so they were telling me true things, but they had this idea that computer scientists are made with a little cookie cutter, and there's one cookie cutter. And it turns out me, in my white woman body, did not, and as a like people person that likes to go to bed early, that doesn't like, who likes basements? But that I didn't fit their cookie cutter, right? And so it was like, oh, Colleen, I think, and And good-intentioned people were like, Colleen, I think computer science isn't for you. Do you know what I mean? Okay, so like, but, and we'll talk more about this, but this idea that like people who are really trying to be working in my best interests were trying to dissuade me against it. And where is that coming from? Okay, so we want to push back against these stereotypes. I love the research by Karen Ashcraft. So she's at the University of Colorado Boulder, and she talks about the ways in which occupation creates an occupational identity. It's like a stereotype, but specific to an identity, specific to a profession. So she talks about the ways in which computer science has this occupational identity of like antisocial, doesn't shower, like only hobbies are computer science, and like all these things that when you put them together, you're like, that doesn't seem real appealing. But most people have the experience of that creates a glass slipper, and you try and jam your foot in that glass slipper, and it's like not a pleasant thing, and you're like, I don't fit. And just a few people, the glass slipper gets to fit. And so we, in pushing back against these stereotypes, are trying to like smash on the glass slipper, yeah, and like break it. That's our goal. I don't know if you knew, but that's what we want to try to do. Okay. So here's an example of a thing that people say is we want diversity, but we don't want to water down the content. Okay, raise your hand if you're like, someone has said something where I'm like, oh, that feels like maybe like a little bit racist, but not like really, really, really racist, but like like feels real, like I'm not sure, and like, what do I say? And then you weren't quite sure what to say. Yeah, cool. We're going to practice that today. And so actually, this is one of the cards. So I'm sorry, I was telling this story to a few people before we started, but from my experience in undergrad at Berkeley, when I got into industry and I saw or experienced sexism, I was like, eye roll, here's what I say to that. Oh, this other sexism, eye roll, here's what I say to that. I've said this thing maybe more than 50 times, and it just feels like I'm like annoyed, but I'm not surprised. And then at Harvey Mudd, where we have like 40 to 50% women in our major, they just had less experience of responding to sexism. And I was like, oh, I'm sending you out into like a often toxic work environment, and you don't have preparation. And so I was like, what if we could gamify responding to sexism and other forms of bias? That seems like mean thing, like, oh, it just seems a little bit problematic, but that's what we're going to do today. Okay, and it came from this, yeah, I'm not kidding. So it came from this resource from the National Center for Women in Information Technology. They've got a bunch of great stuff, and in particular, they came out with a critical listening guide, which is just like a bunch of nonsense people say, like the women are great collaborators. And then, oh, how can you unpack this? What might you respond? What might you say, etc. So they've got a bunch of things on there. Just Google it, critical listening guide, it's great. And I'll post these slides. And so I'm going to have you play a game where you're practicing responding to microaggressions. Oh, microaggressions is like, it started off as defined as like racial slights that may not be intentional, and maybe people already know what this is, but I'll still define it. Racial slights that may not be intentional, like, oh, to an Asian American person, like, oh, where are you really from? And maybe the person didn't mean to send the message that they don't belong and they're not really American, but that is definitely the message that can get sent by like not sort of accepting someone's identity as a Texan. Do you know what I mean? Like, oh, an Asian person can be a Texan, and pushing back against that. Okay, so we're going to practice responding to microaggressions. I think the micro is a little bit problematic because some of these, their impact isn't microscopic, their impact is macroscopic. And so I like the phrase nonsense because I figure I shouldn't use profanity on slides. But I want to teach you how to cheat in playing this game that I'm going to teach you. When anyone ever says any nonsense, you can buy yourself a little bit of time by saying, what makes you say that? So often when I hear a microaggression, I feel like I've been punched in the stomach, or I want to punch them in the stomach. Neither of these are great feelings in my body, and I kind of need to get myself some time. So I might ask, what makes you say that? And that just gives me, I might not even listen, but I might just like get a little bit of breathing room. And sometimes, if I'm not feeling up to it, I don't even say that. I'm just like, Because I think like if there's one thing I'd like you to take away from this, it's like your self-care is more important. Do you know what I mean? Like I think when you have a marginalized identity and then people are going and microaggressing you around that dimension of your identity or many dimensions of your identity, like you spending the time to get the support and love and care that you need is way more important than changing anybody's mind. That is not on you. If microaggressions not related to dimensions of your identity that are marginalized or in a subordinate position of sort of overall power in our broken system, then like it's more your responsibility, but still sometimes you're not going to be up for it, and that's cool too. Okay, so this is the way to cheat. What makes you say that? And then sometimes I can't even get that out, so I say more. And like just keep them talking to buy yourself some time. Okay, and I want to talk about once something has happened, I might use this thing. Have people seen this? We use this in our collaborative classes. Oh, here's the situation, the behavior and impact. So it's like, oh, last week you said this thing, and trying to focus on something that's like not negotiable. Like, oh, you said this racist thing. That's not what I would say. I'd be like, oh, you said sentence, fill in the sentence here, or you did fill in the sentence, or fill in something here. And then without evaluating their character, saying, that had this impact on me. Okay, all right. So I'm just trying to teach you to cheat at the game before we play the game. Okay, so our round one nonsense, I'm going to pass out the cards in just a second, is that all women are the same and need to act like men, but not too much. Have people seen microaggressions around this? Yeah, it's a fun set. And so some of them, we get to more microaggressions that relate to race, but I think it's in thinking about making a workshop that is empowering rather than upsetting, I have stuck more with sexism as a way of trying to recognize the burden that's placed on people of color in responding to microaggressions in their everyday world, that like they might rather opt out of this workshop than experience those or re-traumatize from those experiences. So we end up with like a little bit biasing in favor of sexism comments as a way to practice some of these microaggressions. But I'm trying to do it intentionally, but it still might not be the right decision. Okay, team, so here's how this is going to go. I have decks of cards. I'm going to put you in groups of 3. So we're going to do that first, or like 3 to 5, yeah? You're going to need to be able to hear people. So what I'm going to have you do is look around and point at the people you're going to be in a small group with, okay? And then just look at including people. So everybody should be pointing at someone, yeah? And look around, you're pointing at, yeah? Yeah, and you can even obey, 2 is fine too. Do you know what I mean? But I think the extent to which you get 3 is good. I'm going to give you another 30 seconds to talk to these people, make sure that everybody's included. Kevin, can I have you help me pass these out? 1 per group. Yeah? Can I have you help me pass these out? 1 per group. Yeah? Okay. Can I have you help me pass these out, 1 per group? There might not be any more. Okay, team. Team, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, let me walk you through our plan. I have wonderful helpers passing out some decks of cards. I brought 80 sets of these, so I'll have a bunch free. It was really heavy, and really, like I lifted it over my head into the overhead bin. You can all be very impressed. But I have a bunch of sets of these, and so I'll set them out. And I've also got stickers and pens and magnets, because maybe your life is missing a CS Teaching Tips pen. And that's what's going to make it complete. Okay, but here's the deal. Each card is going to have a question on it. I have another set that relates to inclusive teaching practices. We're going to dig more into like direct bias. So it's like, oh, a student asks what other resources might help them learn. Can you imagine how this is inclusive teaching focused? About like helping students find what resources are going to be helpful to them? Whatever. So if I have the deck of cards, I pull a card, and it says something like, what would you do if? And then I read that thing, and then the people in my group respond. We're going to be dealing mainly with microaggressions, and so sometimes people will say funny things. Do you know what I mean? That's, I think, like a fun option. Like my favorite is just, wow. So that's another way to cheat. The other way to cheat is to say, what makes you say that? But if someone pulls a card, everyone in their group either passes or gives an answer. You're going to move through these kind of quickly. And then at the end of, the person who read the card can pick a winner. I tend to pick the funniest one, but you could pick whatever one you want. It's like apples to apples or Cards Against Humanity. So you pick a winner, and then it actually has my answer on it. So it's like, Colleen, as a white middle-class woman, for someone, here's what I would say in response to this microaggression. Does that make sense? And just in case some of the high points haven't come up, it's like, Colleen would say this, and then the person who read the card can read that. Do you buy that? And also, it's like a nice little pack, because we're going to get through very few cards in this time. And so then you're going to have your own very stack of these cards and be like, what would a white woman say about this? Which might not be helpful to you. I get that. And I think that might be a lot of the world is like, what would a white woman? But whatever. You can not read it, and that's fine too, but it might be helpful. Okay. And so then play will rotate, and you'll do multiple cards. Does that make sense? So one deck of cards per group. You're going to start with the ones that have, team. You're going to start with the ones that have a triangle on them. Yeah? There's 4 different shapes or different rounds in there. Go. Colleen, let's move on. This has been really good, but let's move on. I'm like, Colleen, we should really stick with this round for a little bit longer. Move on would be okay. Stick with this round is okay. Okay, I got mixed, but mainly thumbs up. Okay. Choose your own adventure number 2. Are you like, Colleen, I would really like to challenge you to answer some of these. I don't know that you're going to say that because you already have my answer on the card, but I like to give it as an option. Option 2 is, Colleen, I'd like to hear some reflections from our group. Okay. Option 3 is, no, let's keep it moving. Yeah? Maybe I'm going to remove the let me ask you questions, Colleen. Does that sound okay? Yeah, sure. Okay. So thumbs up is, I'd like to hear what people other than Colleen in this room have to say about this experience. And thumbs down is like, let's keep moving. There's 3 more rounds. Thumbs up is share out. Thumbs down is 3 more rounds. I got mainly thumbs up. I'm sorry. You got outvoted. I'm going to push the button.
So I'm nominating someone. It's not my answer. I'm nominating Beth's answer for... Okay, sorry. I'm putting you on the table. Putting in the spotlight. Okay. So the question was, your colleague says women need family-friendly work environments. And Beth goes, does that mean they need play blocks in the workplace? Little PlayStation?
Yeah.
So that was good.
That's good. Play structures. If we had a jungle gym at my workplace, that would make my life better. Yeah. Other thoughts or sharing? It doesn't have to be funny either. Do you know what I mean? That was a lot of pressure.
I guess I'm curious. I don't know if this mic is...
Oh, yeah. Keep it on.
Okay.
Keep it. I think that they've got it.
Okay. I'm curious what to do if you're a teacher and one of your students says this in a classroom where you feel it might be unprofessional to respond in a certain way.
Yeah. Certainly many of the ways I would like to respond might be inappropriate in a classroom setting. And the power structures within a classroom are super, super tricky. So here's my go-to strategy is like, oh, wow, I don't know what to say. Okay, so someone says something problematic. I say, oh, wow, I don't know what to say. We'll come back to this in the next class because I'm not sure what to say at the moment. Do you know what I mean? And that gives me the opportunity to, I've just if someone's really impacted by it in the classroom, I want to show that I noticed. Do you know what I mean? And things that people say at a dinner party where I'm just like, oh God, I can't be bothered, I engage with in the classroom. Do you know what I mean? Because I'm in a position of power, it's my responsibility. But I just oftentimes I can't think quickly enough to figure out how to reply. So I try and put a pin in it, say we'll come back to it. That provides me the opportunity to try and talk to the student or students who said something one-on-one. Because I think if I can work through it with them of it's tricky to be like, oh, you said this super racist thing. I have a bunch of strategies for trying to deliver that news and try and have someone not hear I don't want them to hear, you're a racist. I want them to hear like, oh, you said this thing that I think is kind of racist. Do you know what I mean? And it's like, I don't think you're a bad person. I think like everybody's breathing in this biased air that we've got in the world. Like you can think of it as smog that you can't avoid, and you're breathing it in. There's another metaphor, which is no one would ever say, oh, I don't need to brush my teeth. I'm a clean person. But people would be like, oh, I don't need to worry about bias. I'm a good person. I got my bias removed. It's like tonsils. I got my bias removed in 2012, and now I'm good. I don't have to brush my teeth. And I think actually we should think, oh, I can play you the clip of this. It's not my line. Jay Smooth, I think. But I got my bias removed so I don't have to worry about it. It's like, oh no, like being not biased is like being a clean person. It's not a binary that, no, you're just clean. It's like a daily practice. Every day I shower and brush my teeth. And every day I should be thinking about how to mitigate the negative impact of white supremacy and sexism on people around me. And that, it's okay. But back to your question. I promise. I'm sorry. We'll make it through. Then I can talk to the person one-on-one and have some of these hard conversations, be like, oh, what did you mean? And like make sure that they feel listened to, and not like sucker punch them with like in front of the whole class, like, oh, you said this thing was racist. We can work through it, and I can get them to the point where like, oh, our relationship is still okay, and I think you understand like the embedded stereotype or the embedded bias within your comment, and like how we can avoid this in the future. I work with them. And then that puts me in a place where the next class, I can talk to the class about the sentence in a way where I've already reassured them that I don't think they're a bad person. Does that make sense? But I don't know. I've never been able to like deal with it on the spot. That's not in my skill set. Oh, wow, I don't know what to say. Yeah. It's a little bit like I don't know what C++ would do in that scenario. Let me get back to you. It's not, I don't know, I think of it in a similar way. I'm like, I want to say, no, never mind. But that's not relevant, but okay. I'm going to cut off. We're going to come back to the discussion-y type thing, but you're going to do another round. Okay. So this next round I think is funny. Have people heard ones like this? Jim drove his kids to school. What a great dad. I don't have kids, but if I thought that that's how much work it took to be a good parent, I'd be like, oh yeah, you don't have to be superhuman to do that. And have people seen this Twitter handle, the man who has it all? So it takes like advice column advice for women, and then he flips it and says it for a man. So one of my favorites is, pro tip, if you struggle to get your wife to do her share of the child care, it could be that your standards are too high. You use the wrong tone of voice, or you criticize too much. Can you imagine this being said to a mother? Yeah. I don't know. I think a piece of this is I find microaggressions and like racism and sexism like pretty draining. Do you know what I mean? And particularly our news cycle, like I find it pretty draining. And so when there are ways where I can get a good chuckle, do you know what I mean? And it's like a little bit cathartic. And I think if the news makes you real sad and you don't have support structures in place for that, I think it's a good idea to identify and create those support structures. And like little things like my parents don't read or talk about the news 2 hours before bed. And I think, oh, that's a really sensible thing to do. And so I just want to, for folks in this room, I want to remind you like, oh, your self-care is really important, you know? You deserve to be like joyful during the day, and that might not seem feasible with our current news cycles, but that doing the self-care so that you can live a full life is still really important. Okay, they make me laugh. Okay, so our round 2 nonsense is going to be women and only women should parent, and I should make comments about and to women that I never make to men. Can you imagine what some of these are going to be? Yeah? Okay. Yeah. So a fun thing that happens when these cards are read is people will groan in a group. You know, oh my God, someone said that to me yesterday or whatever. And then other people will be like, this one's problematic? Do you know what I mean? And I think that's legit. Like, I think own it, right? Of like this is all about learning. It's not like, oh, everyone needs to know all of the like microaggressions. Like, there's tons of microaggressions around ability and disability that like I might not get because I interact with the world as an able-bodied person and I'm not thinking about them. Do you know what I mean? And so in each of our bodies there are marginalized and non-marginalized identities, and we like can inhabit both of those in different power structures in the world. And so we're going to have spots that we just don't expect or experience those microaggressions, and that's nice, but it's also like a good opportunity to learn. Okay, team, you're going to go back to your group, and you're going to be doing the questions. Flip to the ones that have circles on them. Yeah? Okay, go. 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, team, bring it back together. Bring it back together. You're like Colleen. Last time you gave us a choose your own adventure, and not this time. Team, I think some people might need to leave at 2. Raise your hand if that's you. Okay, yeah, some people are going to need to leave at 2. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to talk for 4 minutes. Don't worry, I'm not going to actually end at 2, but I'm going to talk for 4 minutes. I'm going to get us ready to go for round 3. But then as we're transitioning to like our new groups that don't have people who need to leave at 2, the people who need to leave at 2 can come up and get a set of the cards or a pen or a sticker or a handy sheet about department inclusivity. Yeah? Does that sound okay? So I'll keep watch on the time, but if we hit 2 o'clock, you are welcome to boo, and we'll stop it and we'll do the thing. Yeah? Okay. I think it's really helpful. I do that when I'm teaching. If I make a mistake, like I say the wrong words or I write the wrong thing, someone will raise their hand and I'll be like, let me finish my eloquent thought. And they're like, oh, you like made a typo or like you screwed something up early in that sentence. But if they just boo, then we can address the problem right away. Yeah, I didn't tell you I was going to provide teaching tips as well in this talk, but there you go. Okay, so I think the Bias Buster group is probably familiar with some of the background context around bias in resume studies. So the idea is they take one resume and then they change the name on the top of it so that people will guess it's a black man or a white man or a Latinx man or a white woman or etc. for lots of combinations in lots of different fields. Identical resumes, send it to thousands of people and then see who thinks that they should be called back. And there's just like bias, just like good people, do you know what I mean? There's just bias where they like all of the negative stereotypes we have about people play out in people's evaluation of these resumes, identical resumes. And I read this research and I'm like, oh gosh, I don't want to be biased. Do you know what I mean? And then I read this research and I'm like, but yeah, it's been replicated a bunch of times, but this probably doesn't apply to me, right? Like, I'm different, right? Do you think? No, I'm not even getting, you guys are mean. I'm not even, I'm like, oh, I read this research and then more research and then more research that replicates it in different fields. And I'm like, oh, I'm all the things I don't want to be. Do you know what I mean? And so every day I got to brush my teeth, essentially, and be thinking about the impact I have on the world. Okay, and actually the transition here is a little bit rocky, but have people read this relates a little bit more to round 1, Lean In, where it talks a lot about the bias, and I think it actually does a really good job of reviewing some of that bias literature, but it also just says if women just try harder and lean in, then it'll all be fixed. And this book, which I like more, is What Works for Women at Work. And it says, women shouldn't have to be walking on a tightrope between being seen as competent but not too aggressive or whatever. But there is a tightrope, and what are some of the strategies for walking on that tightrope? And I think it's nice. Okay, how are we doing on time? Okay. Yeah, you shouldn't have to, but you do. Pause for a second. This is an example from Becky Whaling Packard's book that I absolutely love. I have these 3 ecosystems. Pretend you're all ecologists. I have 3 ecosystems. One where clip-art ducks are thriving. One where clip-art ducks are dwindling. And one where they are absent. Yeah? And you're an ecologist. What questions do you have? Did anybody ask, are the ducks leaning in? No, that's an absurd question to ask. Maybe we should think about what structures and environments we can create. I don't know if you want the ducks, but if you want the duck, like what environment and structures do we need to change to support a thriving community? And so this, I think the example of the glass slipper sort of contrasts with that lean-in mentality of like, but if women just tried harder, it would be all fixed. And folks have probably seen something like this, where equality is just everybody gets the same thing, and equity is everybody gets what they need. Similar, but, and then justice is you're like, tip the table, break down the structures, burn it all down, yeah? Why is there a fence? Okay, okay. So our next round is this stuff isn't a problem, and trying to solve it has created new, bigger problems. So that's our next round. We're right at 2, so I'll have people stand up and we'll have to form groups. So we'll take essentially like a 2-minute break. Team 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm sorry to cut you off. How are we doing? Okay, we're doing okay still? Okay, that's great. Thanks for staying. I know a bunch of people had to leave at 2, and don't worry, we still have enough cards up here in case you didn't get them. Okay, so one point I want to make is that like the power dynamics and all of this matter a lot. My original prototype for the game, someone would pull the card, and then reading something like what you saw, but at the same time, other people would pull and read at the same time to like overload you with information. Who said the microaggression? And then who will hear whether or not you reply? Does that make sense? And like thinking about the classroom context or whatever. It's your boss. It's like some punk on a bus. Do you know what I mean? Like what? Like all these contexts matter in terms of how we reply. And sometimes it's going to be the right decision for your self-care. That's always the first thing I care about. Sometimes it's going to be the right decision for your self-care to like not push it. Sometimes it's going to be the right decision for the power dynamic in the situation to be like, not today. Do you know what I mean? Like, yeah? Yeah, okay. Power dynamics matter. It's an important thing that I think would be overwhelming in the game. I thought like having 3 people like read cards at you would be a good simulator of being microaggressed. And one of my friends was like, and someone would also punch you in the stomach. This is funny. And one thing that I think has been coming up in some of the groups, I discourage any violence in response to microaggressions, just so we can make that explicit. Maybe like some property damage. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, okay. Team. So I want to talk about, we're going to flip it a little bit. The last round is a little bit more potpourri, like a little bit of everything. But one of the themes is thinking about how we respond when we say something problematic. And I want to look at this example of you stepped on my toe, and then someone says, I didn't mean to. That's an inappropriate thing to say, right? But like also say someone is like, Colleen, you said this thing that was super racist. Like, can you imagine that my instinct, like every core of my being is like, but I didn't mean to. Do you know what I mean? Right? Because that's true. I didn't mean to. But it's not relevant. Do you know what I mean? And like when someone's like, yo, you stepped on my toe, it's like a little weird to assume that, like this seems to assume that they thought I meant to. And then I'm clarifying. Oh, let me clarify for you. I didn't mean to. And so there might be better ways we can do that. And in general, I think for people, we're flipping a little bit. For people who might accidentally microaggress others, we need to think about separating our intent versus our impact. So like I go about in the world with the intent to not harm people. I think that's like a good way to go. Yeah? That does not guarantee me that my impact is always positive or that my impact is not negative. And the fact that I intended to not hurt people does not matter when I actually hurt people. Okay, and it's not nice, I think, to be like, oh, I wish that I could like have you come to this workshop and be like, here's my magic wand. You'll never hurt people again. Wouldn't that be nice? And here's the deal is like, as a white person, I need to be talking about race and racism. I think it's my responsibility. Does that mean I'm always going to say the right thing? No. Is it likely that in trying to talk about this, because I think it's a really important thing that we should be talking about, I might hurt people? I might hurt specifically people that I'm trying to break down the system so that they're not systematically hurt. Do you know what I mean? So it's like uber bad feeling to me. I don't know, maybe you all feel fine about this, but I'm like, I don't want to hurt people, but I know I need to talk about this stuff to try and like do my part to make the world a better place. But in doing that, I'm going to screw up. So we're all going to be in a position to apologize, particularly because within our identities, there are marginalized and non-marginalized dimensions of our identity. So we're all going to be in the spot where we miss things and we accidentally microaggress people. It hit a low point here. Do you think it's good that some people left at the 2 o'clock mark? You can share this with them. Be like, you're going to screw this up and you're hurt a bunch of people. But I think that they're like practicing what we do around this is really important, because if someone tells me I've hurt them, or if someone provides like, oh, hey, Colleen, that was super racist, like I feel immediately defensive, yeah? And so just like when I get microaggressed, I need a response that I can eke out. My instinct is to defend. My instinct is like flight. That's cool. That's what's going to be happening inside. And I just try and hide that. I just try and hide that and be like, oh, it turns out it's not about me. If I said something super racist, we shouldn't now start talking about how bad I feel about that. Do you know what I mean? Maybe I'll start crying. That it's not about me. When I like screw up, or when we screw up, it's about the person that we hurt. And so if someone tells me I did something super racist, or I offended them, or any number of things that I might screw up, my reaction is, I'm sorry. And it's true, right? Do you know what I mean? Like, I didn't mean to is true, and I'm sorry is true and appropriate. Does that make sense? And I think there's this narrative that good people can't be biased. And again, it's not like your tonsils that you can just get your bias removed. We've got to be clean people. And on this one, I will end with a reminder of this, but the idea of, Colleen, you did this bad thing. I'm sorry. In the future, I'll do this to avoid that. And I think that communicates my intent in a way that I didn't mean to doesn't. Do you buy that? Yeah. Team. Okay, so our next round is good people can't be biased. Yeah, and actually like sort of a hodgepodge of some other things that I thought would be fun, bad microaggressions to put on cards. Yeah, that's what you got in a store. Okay, this is our last round, and then we'll do a little wrap up. Go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. Hi. You get to keep a set of these cards. I want to remind us of this bigger picture again of thinking about whenever anyone describes diversity and then is really just talking about white women, we're going to push back. Whenever people describe stereotypes, we're going to push back. Be like, oh, what data do you have for that? What makes you say that? I think that's an important piece. This last piece that I mentioned is this: I'm sorry that I did X. In the future, I will do Y. Shows much more intention to not be harmful than I didn't mean to. And that because we need to be all in terms of upping our game to be able to talk about things that we might be afraid to talk about because we might say the wrong thing and we might hurt people, which is the opposite of what we want to do. But engaging and learning online is on the internet has a lot of resources as well, is super important. Okay, so team, I'd love to do 10 minutes. I think I was just going to put my contact info. Oh, I didn't tell you why these things were up there. Microsoft gave me some money, and then And then I use that money to print these cards for you.
Oh,
yeah. Yeah. And then the NSF funded my CS Teaching Tips thing, and I'm working with the CRA, and I have a new project about trying to help institutions make institutional change, and they funded this Tips for Department Inclusivity, and I'm working with the Computing Research Association on that grant. And so I put those up there. Yeah. And then I work at Harvey Mudd, and they bought me and Beth a plane ticket. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And then I'm staying with my friends Catherine and Dan. Would that have been funny if I put their photos up? Okay, team. I want to do like just a brief Q&A. We've got 8 more minutes before 2:30. Yeah. Yes, I feel positive about that being on.
So a scenario: you're observing a situation where several people are interacting with each other, and one of these people makes a comment that you personally find potentially offensive, and you're really uncertain if the other person around whom this comment was made and possibly directed to that person either heard it or found it offensive or would potentially really justifiably be concerned about you getting involved and saying anything.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I think it's a helpful thing to think about, like when, maybe as a white person, is it not the right time for me to like step in and save the day? Yeah. Have people heard of like white savior idea? Do you know what I mean? That I'm like the white person and I'm going to come in and save everyone. And it's just like, oh, I think that as a white person, it's my responsibility to fight against racism and racist systems. Like, yeah, but when there are times where in doing that work, I can be not the person on the stage, and it can be a person of color who is getting the credit for the work, that's what makes sense to do. That's a way in which I can help fight these like racist systems. Okay, now coming back to your point. It's like a tricky social thing to navigate, and you're not always going to do the right thing. Do you know what I mean? Like sometimes you're going to try and intervene and they're going to be like, what are you doing? Like, you made it worse, yeah? And sometimes you're not going to intervene and then they're going to be like, oh my God, I can't believe you didn't intervene, yeah? I really need to figure out a way to like have this in the middle so that we can end on a more positive note. But I think it's just like, oh, you're going to screw it up. And so I think thinking about the balance of like, oh, like I want to speak on behalf of, but I don't want to speak over others, I think is the right thing to be thinking about. And the extent to which you can use some of those strategies of like, oh wow, like maybe we should talk more about that point. Do you know what I mean? Like I might be able to kickstart a conversation in a way where I can then read someone's body language to see if they're like, oh yeah, take this one for me. Or they're like, no, let's not talk about this now. Do you know what I mean? And so I might be able to throw little bombs, do you know what I mean? Or like little pins in it, and then try and get a read of people's body language. But it's not ever going to go perfectly. Yeah, but it's important enough to try and read the situation and do your best. Yeah, other questions or comments? Yeah, we got one in the back.
So in the previous slide, in your example of yes, I'm sorry I did X. In the future I'll do Y. Is it presumptuous to like right after having made a mistake to assume we now know what the right answer is right after making a wrong choice? Would it be better to like ask what would be the appropriate response rather than coming up with like an alternative?
This is the perfect question, actually. So imagine. So a conversation I often have with people is they're like, oh, people of color have a different experience in the world. And like people interact with them in different ways than with me as a white person. And people will tell me this. And they're like, whoa, epiphany. And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, I should have people of color explain that to me. And they should tell me all about their experiences. And like, I should probably just ask all the people of color that I know and have them tell me. And it's just like, oh, that might not be a great option. That's like a lot of emotional labor that these people would then have to do. And so one that fits into the why of like, Colleen, you did this thing that was super racist. I'm sorry that I did this thing that was super racist. I'm going to go on the internet and have people of color who have already done the emotional labor of creating blogs and videos and all the things, and I'm going to read those. And that the people who have already put up their experiences have done that emotional labor for the masses to benefit from, and I should really have been doing more of my homework. And I'll do my homework to figure out how I can avoid this type of thing again. I'm really sorry. Do you know what I mean? So I think usually the internet is the answer. Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm going to try and be a less terrible person using the internet. And that's not the normal service that the internet provides. It's usually to make you think that there's no hope for humanity, but it can also provide a lot of education. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
You talked about doing institutional change, and I'm wondering if there's some quick kind of tips for...
7 of them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit, or should we just read the thing?
You should be surveying students to know what's super broken. You should optimize the on-ramps into your intro courses. So a thing that exists is educational inequality at the K-12 level, where if you have a lot of money, or because of redlining and the housing market, if you're a white person, you're more likely to have access to high quality schooling. And so we should be thinking about, for students who didn't have access to CS or sort of preparatory courses for electrical engineering, what would it look like when they get to Berkeley or another institution and have them succeed? So there are counter examples that I can provide where to be successful getting into the major, you have to get straight A's in the intro courses. And so people who have a ton of programming experience, they've been programming since they were 1.5, and then they get to the intro course and they really should skip the first or second intro class, but because they need a straight A, they take it. And then the course gets customized to them rather than to people who it's meant to serve, which is people without experience. And so we should be focused on those intro courses. You should monitor performance patterns. So a thing that we saw at Berkeley was when I was here, there was a narrative that we're not sure why, but women just aren't as good at data structures. I don't know what it is, maybe they're lady parts. No one said that. That's me being glib. But women were doing less well in data structures, but they were doing the same as men. And again, it's not a gender binary. They were doing the same as men in the intro course. And then it stopped there. Rather than detecting these gaps in performance and being someone's gender identity is not an explanatory variable for lower performance. And the extent to which I accept an identity as an explanatory variable for lower performance means I'm just relying on some implicit stereotype, and I'm applying it to these individual humans. And when we looked over 7 or 14 semesters, I think maybe it was just 7 semesters, and we controlled for whether or not the students reported having Java experience, there was no difference between men and women's performance in data structures. And so there was here at Berkeley, and also at Harvey Mudd, there was a structural barrier that was created where if you had APCS in Java, it wasn't going to affect you in the intro course, in the first course. It was going to affect you in data structures, which was the first time they saw Java. And so this on-ramp, which includes those first 2 courses, created a barrier for people who didn't have access to AP Computer Science. Since it's an opt-in course, we have to think about who tells students to take APCS or not, who are those influencers, and who do they think belongs in an APCS course, and then within the ecosystem of schools, what schools serving what students have access to offer that course. And so it's like a canary in the coal mine. We don't accept demographic variables as explanatory variables, but we should be measuring them to try and figure out are we really screwing stuff up? And then there's 4 more, but we're out of time. Thank you so much for coming. You're probably going to want to, you're I thought my life was complete, but then I found out that there are CS Teaching Tips stickers. And now I realize that I need those. I also have magnets. And actually, I think if you want to put these on department fridges or other things that are magnetic in your department, I think that's not bad for the world. Okay, again, thank you so much for coming, and come grab some things. Yeah?